Let's talk about the Grim Reaper and its many associations that a lot of people don't really see in the modern day. We know the Grim Reaper is a skeleton wearing a black robe and some sinister guy wielding a large scythe and handling an hourglass. That's our current depiction, right? Well, to tell you the truth, it's not only the image of the Grim Reaper, but the idea of where the Grim Reaper came from is really complex, and it goes back much further than they're going to talk about, but as I do, I'll add on. Stories change from time to time, and it'll be very difficult to find its very origin, and there is no good evidence to prove it. But before I discuss the different faces of the angel of death, let's try to track down its histories. Now, let me start by a grim thought and things, but I don't know what age you were whenever you found out about death. But I experienced it a few different ways. Once with a bird dying that we had, and we weren't going to see it anymore, and all those things. And I made them open up the box and actually proved to me that it was there. And I touched it; it was there. And years later, lost a grandma, heard about people losing things, didn't go to the funerals and so on like that. And then my own grandmother passed away, one of them. That grandfather had already passed away before any of us kids were born. And so I got to learn about it by that, but it's kind of surrounds us all, and I don't know if there's probably people who don't think of it in some form or fashion throughout almost every day of your life, whether it concerns yourself or loved ones or animals or um, plants, even, and things like that, if you'll go that far with it. But when we talk about this here that we're about to talk about, try to get biblical connections too, and I'll try to show them to you as we weave our way through this. J. Touchette said that the idea of Grim Reaper comes from the Greek god Cronus. In his article Origins of the Grim Reaper, he said that Kronos is known as the father of time, or father time, or ancient of days. He is associated with the Grim Reaper because the Grim Reaper takes Kronos' image with the hourglass and the scythe in hand. The story about Kronos eating his children means that time devours all things. In other terms, nothing lasts forever. And there are three Greek words that make great connection of the Grim Reaper and Kronos himself. There are Chronos, spelled that way, time, Kronos, the Greek god of harvest before Demeter was initiated into it, and Corona, or crow, this bird. And you'll find that bird associations are much more prevalent, as I've shown you many times in the past, with all of these pagan and other religions that go with this concept from the Wayback Machine, and something that we still have today. If you look at this depiction of Cronus, or what we know of as, you say, well, that's Father Time, and he's like this angel thing. Yeah, we'll look at another depiction coming up of the same situation. But in the Father Time story and trilogy, it's actually 1 year, and it's the baby New Year, and he grows up through his life and then becomes the elder and then passes on. And this is the story of Christmas and Father Time. It also has to do with the Winter Warlock and all kinds of other things that I've done other videos about before, but not to stray off and to try to keep myself on this same web here that we have going on. You see, he has this scythe, as in Scythians, and what that's used for, in the reaper of the harvest. And so you reap what you sow. And so things can be used in allegories and in teaching situations from the Wayback Machine. And these people that were the earliest farmers could use it in a concept of like, why don't we eat the grain right now? Because, watch, and you plant this field of grain, and then what the hell, you just threw it under the ground. When just like Jack and the Beanstalk, that shit grows up and becomes an incredible crop that not only feeds you for a long term, but you can get money to buy the other things that you need to sustain yourself and so on. In fact, if I didn't go hunting or have success in the hunt, I could buy things. And this time of year, I don't know when you're seeing this, but this time of year of Christmas that we're at right now in this season was a time when people could get together. And quite often the apple harvester would bring a whole lot of apples, and there was trading and bartering going on for things that could help sustain him. And he could get some bread and this, that, and the other. But also the people that weren't able to make it, as long as there's a time of abundance, and even when there wasn't, there was sharing, which is extremely important in these ancient civilizations. And I'm talking about back in Cro-Mag time. I'm not talking about recent, but it applies all the way through this that we're speaking of a reaping of a harvest and a time and a fruition. One example of this is planting of trees. You know, one of the stories in the Bible is Abraham planted a tree when he went to a new place. My father, when we moved into the house that we lived in for the last part of our life, as he retired and such, we planted a tree. In fact, we got one for our neighbors and planted it. He planted it on his fence lot line, and he said, whatever grows on that side, you can have. And it was a pear tree. My mom used to make the most killer pear preserves to where he just gave them a whole bunch of them. Eventually, it got to the point where you could just take some bushels to a guy that would do the local side selling on it. He didn't have any pears, and so you could give him bushels of pears and go, you know, I'll do $5 for the whole thing, just give me back my bushels. Well, $5 back then was more like 30, $35 now, but still. Anyhow, this concept of nothing lasts forever. I can go a little bit deeper and kind of south here real quick for a second and tell you that this idea of him devouring his children also is relayed from the ancient Phoenicians in a tale that comes through the Greeks, to where Chronos, in a great time long, long ago, signifying time again, that through a great time of strife, he helped save everybody, and he sacrificed his only son, and they named the land after him. And the land, his son's name was Illiad, and so they named it Judea after him. Anat is named after, or Anatolia is named after Anat, by the way. It's not a name we always say whenever we're talking about these things. In modern day Turkey, well, then you could just say Anatolia, and then that would take you to the Wayback Machine. It was referred to that by a few people around the whole situation, but you can find that the Hittites that were living there wouldn't have been referring to that. It was Hattusha, but still at the same time, in this idea, that's where the biblical tale of the sacred land comes from, and this thing that had happened and where things had happened at. Let's just simply put it that way and try to get on a little bit here. So he's Father Time, he's the god of the harvest and everything. When you plant a tree, what you're doing is you're hoping that it grows up, and you're not gonna, it's something that it's a looking forward, something that Caucasians kind of, for a long time in human civilization, were the only ones that did. And it goes along with the Johnny Appleseed tale of, I'm gonna plant this thing, and as I reach a maturity, and a lot of these trees and such would take 20 years to grow up. And we find that the cycle of time of these planets going around us takes a 12-year cycle and a 20-year cycle. That's important. And it also goes with the cycles of time of the Sumerians and the 60 base thing that we still have with 12 and 60 seconds in a minute, 60 seconds in an hour. People wonder where that comes from. I've got enough videos about that, along with sacred geometry, how it all works together incredibly in life. And there's a concept of death too, but we'll get into that. So not only is he said to have been the origin of all things, but he outlasts all things, and this is that outlasting his children. When someone could outlast their children, that's almost an elven immortality where you're not quite immortal, like maybe a vampire, and people think about things like that nowadays, where you aren't going to last forever, but you extend your life extremely from what would have happened. In fact, everybody comes from that. Although in the biblical tale, it's always looks at as people used to live a hell of a lot longer and then it got shorter. Well, things happened and it screwed everybody over. And the weird thing is that the earliest inclination where this thing that we have of these bird effigies, we showed in this last year, in fact, a few burials of these Scythians and other people that they knew were shamans. They had hemp with them and so on, and all these things associated with it. But they also knew that that must have been a death cult type thing, and one has all these bird skulls all over it and the mask and things that went along with it. I've got other videos, on it and everything. Look it up, along with the swan thing. In fact, I've got another video about connections of the swan. And the earliest flute was made out of a swan's bone, and quite often people don't make the connection, but what we have on the wings here of angels are basically swan type wings or eagles type wings, and to this day we go with this on eagle's wings whenever someone passes away and so on. Well, how old is that gesture? Well, it goes incredibly way back. The earliest form of death deification that we found is where they deify the person by taking their head after death, and the body is put up on a dais, and these birds eat it, which had to do with ravens and vultures, which is carried all the way into Egypt and so on, and it takes the body up into the heavens. And so this association of birds comes from way back when. And make no mistake about it, this is this angel type thing. Oh, well, this is Chronos. This is that da-da-da. Yeah, right. But you'll find that this crow, and it says corona, crow. Well, corona has to do with the sun. There are cycles of the sun going around every day, but that's really us spinning. It's sitting there. We're spinning around it, but we're all flying along, right? But then it takes us a year to go around this. And how many years does someone have? And that's another counting of time. And it's specific and special to you when you were born, and birthdays and things like that that we can keep up because of our modern calendar that we have going on. But corone has to do with the sun, but it also is the root word of the same linguistics that go with the word crone, which it sometimes is a derogatory term for an old elder woman like a widow, which actually has a term meaning staring out the window because she's waiting for someone to come home that never did. Bad connotations are whenever they would send somebody to war, or they had killed him perhaps of, making bad food or doing something, and he never recovered and everything and stuff. But old crones are the women version of this same Chronos. She's an elder of time, crone. It's really that simple. It can be taken out of context and used in different ways, and just like calling somebody a bitch because it's a girl dog, but then you find the attributes of how a dog will start to act once it becomes a mama dog, and how protective she gets and everything else, and it's really not such a bad thing. But when somebody's acting up nowadays, they utilize that. Let's go on out of that because we're off left field and off the tree again. See, that tree has a lot to do with things because a tree grows up and bears fruit, and then that tree can apple fall not far from the tree, and you have children, they grow up, and they'll have children, and if you do things right, you get to see your grandchildren, and it really, truly is the fruits of your labor because you planted a tree of your family tree, And then at some point, hopefully, as long as they don't go SJW freak out and whatever, you'll have this ideal of them bearing fruit. And always noticed through my whole life how special it is for grandparents to see the grandkids. The other guys show up and they just talk to them. Hey, what's going on? Let me see that kid. Hey. Yeah, there's something special about that, and I'm awaiting for that point in my life, which shouldn't be too much farther in the future, although no one's pregnant at this point. Let's continue here, and notice this picture on the left, this Greek god of silent death, a winged youth armored with a sword. I tell you now, this is the Archangel Michael, who is quite along associated with it, or in some forms Azazel, but make no bones about it, no pun intended, that is an angel with a sword. Everyone can see it, plain as day. Thanos, an angel with so much power that he could snap his fingers and make 1/3 of all the people die, like in a great plague or something like that to happen, that you could blame upon an angel of death, like the death that swept through Egypt and took all the firstborn. That same type of angel. Are you following me? The Grim Reaper also took his image that we have nowadays from the Norse corpse goddess Valkyries, and also to the Greek god Thanatos, the escort of the dead to the underworld. As you can see, with the Grim Reaper's job derives from what Thanatos do for the Greek god Hades. He sends the mortal soul to Hades, who is awaiting the underworld. Now we talk about this across the river Styx, and Charon, this boatman. And quite often this boatman has a lantern that looks like a hourglass, but it takes the place of it, and a scythe, and he too is a skeletal warrior that you have to pay the ferryman. People used to put coins over the eyes of the dead and so on, and help to pay for his burials and pay through his way of the underworld and so on. It's still real hard to know if he's real or not. The Grim Reaper itself breeded newfound imagination to some ancient authors and storytellers. The thing is, the Grim Reaper nowadays becomes a great story to retell by the most promising writers, even like Homer, who used Thanatos as the Grim Reaper, together with his twin brother Hypnos, like hypnotic, the Greek god of sleep, writing his famous story in the Illiad itself. So you don't think it's kept till modern day, or even in this religion that we have now, but it's definitely there, but it's a part that's just weaved out. But it's kind of like the names have been changed to protect the innocent. No, let's just go on. Now that we are through the checking the sort of origin of the Grim Reaper, let us proceed to how the Grim Reaper is depicted in different places around the world. Since the world is full of different kinds of people, it is indeed that different types of culture arises. The world is old, and so its culture and beliefs are. Before he gets into this, and I do, let's talk about one of the oldest depictions we have is this god on a chariot riding through the sky, letting you know that it's a star doing itself across the sky, and it's pulled by serpents. But if you look close at it, he's being pulled through the prime of his life, and in doing so, one serpent is looking back, the other serpent is looking forward. Hope you know the depiction. He's going across clouds. This is somebody during their prime of life, looking forward and looking back. And I could go off for a whole video on what that has to do with everything and some other depictions and so on, but it wouldn't necessarily be about the Grim Reaper, for he's the ideal of death. But yet, whenever you're a child and you see your granddad and you know that bird died because it got old, and then your mom talks about granddad's old or something, they talk about it, then all of a sudden you freak out and you go, oh my God, is he going to die? And we're like, no. He said, well, older is what I should have said. I'm older. I remember one of my daughters finding out, and she was literally horrified, and she was extremely young, but finding out about it. And, we had to calm her down and tell her, that it's not going to happen anytime soon or anything like that, and that maybe we should talk to her more about it. So we did, and in doing so, we let her know it's going to be a long, long time. I mean, I used to be a kid, and then I grew up, and then we had children and everything, and we're like Grandma was whenever we were the little kid that you are now, and da-da-da, and kind of break that fourth wall with a kid, which sometimes you try to keep them in a fantasy world, sometimes too long, and so on. But, Santa Claus, of course, is something that you can keep, but the reality of Santa Claus and its situations are something in itself. Let's just go on. Now that we are through checking the sort of origins of the Grim Reaper, let us proceed on how the Grim Reaper is depicted in different places around the world. Since the world is full of different kinds of people, it's indeed the different types of culture arises. The world is old, and so are all its cultures and beliefs. The article Grim Reaper's Death by the fantasy writer T.F. Walsh said that in other cultures the Grim Reaper is represented as an angel, or a skeleton, or an old hag or crone, and even a god or a goddess, which takes the place of death. And this is generally, I've found by studying ancient cultures, is whenever one culture takes over the other, they take a persona of one of their other god and goddesses and take that as the pantheon that would run the underworld portion of it. Sometimes even by name, but other by indication. And this is one of a few different formations that'll make everything twist and run different from then on. Whether it's a god or a goddess, of course, makes things change from then on, and who had kids and everything else, and of course it's got to be by the gods. So according to the article in Greek culture, Thanatos is the angel of death, just like what I'd said a while ago, but he's a young man with wings, armored with a sword in his hand. His duty is to send the deceased soul to Hades and in the underworld. That's an Archangel Michael type situation. In the Celtic folklore, the Grim Reaper type is known to be called Ankau, like Ankh, but O-U, ending it, therefore the end of life. Skeleton, he rides a cart wearing a large hat, like Gandalf kind of, on his head, and he has a revolving head, which literally sees everything around him. You can't sneak up on him. Yeah, and he's kind of like a scarecrow type situation, but if you look at this picture over at the right, you can picture Gandalf of the undead in this same type situation, and you probably couldn't sneak up on him, for a wizard arrives precisely when he intends to. In Norway, the Grim Reaper is called Pesta, the plague hag, like pestilence. Pesta brings either a broom, which signals that everybody's going to die, or a rake, which signifies that some will survive, like raking through the leaves and leaving some behind, or the chad and the wheat and so on that we talk about and is in the Bible. In Germany, Odin is the major god in Norse mythology. People also call him Grimnir. Together with the Valkyries, they establish the idea of the Grim Reaper. There's also the goddess of hell that apparently had died along the way in a trip of the ancient people and the heraldry that brought into Britain a long, long time ago with that Tuatha De Danann and so on. And so she has taken over that, along with a dog. And that's where we kind of get that from, too. Lithuanians believe that Grim Reaper's counterpart is Giltine, a ugly woman with a long blue nose and a poisonous tongue. Hindus believe that the angel of death is Yama, or Yamaraj. Their god of the underworld. In Chinese mythology, people believe that the god of death named Yan Lao, while in Japanese mythology, Izanami is the goddess of death. In an article written by an anonymous writer entitled Angel of Death or Grim Reaper, there's a white-robed Reaper instead of wearing a black robe. The Reaper wears a white robe. He still has the job of bringing the souls to the realm of the unknown, but it's more like an angel instead of somebody wearing darkness. Well, this is a moment of judgment, and you weigh your soul versus a feather and the pearly gates and all the things that are really the same situation again. And to this day, we wear black at funerals. It's a moment of judgment, and in a way, we take part in that judgment as we recant stories and tell what happened and so on. Remember when my aunt died, we got to go over there and we were having the whole eat and get together afterwards, and they started talking about stuff. Some I knew about, some I didn't. Next thing you know, they flip open a couple of photo albums and start going through it, and it's like, whoa, and you start hearing all kinds of stories. My dad had passed away before that situation a few years, and I brought up a couple of situations about that, and we were over at my sister's then, and out flies stories that you never heard, or you heard certain versions of maybe from your dad that you never really heard out of this man, which was his brother and there when it happened, and so on. And yeah, it's a quite an interesting endeavor if you've ever gone through it, but you wish that this would happen more. Well, at this Christmas time that we're at right now, no matter when you're looking at it, people used to do this situation and go through these ancient stories and kind of keep them. And some of those became legend, of course, because of bigger things happened, and legend grows into myth. And there we have it. This only signifies that we have enriched our culture throughout the years. Even if we have different depictions of the Grim Reaper, we still come up with the idea about his job to guide the dead person's soul to the gates of the afterlife, either in heaven or in hell, and quite often it involves a river, which we've talked about recently. Sounds kind of scary, right? Well, you know, that's life. And so I could go down, and there's another article here and another one about the Grim Reaper and so on. But also this has to do with the four horsemen, for indeed death is one of those. Whenever I was a kid, you know, listening to Metallica and all of these things, they always had all these symbols go with them, and they're always, you know, got a star. If you look at this guy, he too has an hourglass. He rides the dark nightmare. He has the scythe on him. There were groups. Well, there was Grim Reaper. I didn't really like that. They were just a little too hard, but I liked some of their grooves through their songs and so on. A lot of their lyrics were pretty cool. But Metallica also had the four horsemen talking about revelations and so on and everything. And I've talked about how that already really happened in 73 AD. But also whenever you look at something that's going to be like the changing of Valhalla and how that's all supposed to go. And in a Thanatos type situation, this again connects towards Halloween and this situation of a lot of people dying that people still kept sacred somehow. And it's the season of the dead, the season of the witch, the turning of time, and we have these asteroid showers that go along with it. I've talked about in other videos, and probably too many times, about how that connects to these witch's broom and stuff that goes on through it. And oh well, the witch's broom, maybe we're all going to die. That's where all this comes all the way back from 10,000 BC, coming out of the last ice age. Whenever I first kind of were getting inklings that people were saying it came out of things and shamanistic stuff from way back when, we didn't have much of it. Now we see Göbekli Tepe and its staunch identification of these people in astrotheology and their depth of thought, and how that's grown from, you know, people talked about Egypt and its 2400 got it going real good. Well, Sumer 1,000 years before that, and really goes back to like 5200 and this, that, and the other, Catalhoyuk and all these different places that have popped up civilization at. But every single one of them kept this along with it. But that horse, didn't come into it until much later. There were other depictions, other animals that go along with that. Seasonal animals, quite often. Animals that would change during the seasons. Spring bucks, so on. Through all these ancient rituals that really, if you look back at it, it connects to an elder time whenever they all had this same kind of thing going on. And it really isn't very much different, for they went through death. We'll always have a point where all of us seem to go through death. One of the depictions I wanted to show you in this, and don't have it pulled up right now, was a depiction of somebody with a caduceus pushing back a skeleton, but the skeleton had an hourglass. I almost thought I'd open with it, but in that situation, in a modern day, we, through medicine and that caduceus medical symbol, push back the hourglass. What's strange about it is this thing is like 3,400 years old, like 1400 BC, and it still has that depiction. But we could talk about hourglasses and extending life. I sure hope anybody who's listened to it this far especially extends or is able to extend their own life, and death doesn't touch you through this time of the year where we go through the death of each year and bring back. But if you have, and or even recently, remember those of the past and realize that you are becoming your parents, and your parents are becoming the grandparents, and then you're going to become the grandparent, and it rolls through that circle of life. And that's what this all embodies in situations that people back then seem to have been embracing a little bit easier than a modern day, with the depictions that we have and the concepts that we get along with it. And it's shared and talked about through all these ancient cultures more, almost on a, and definitely on a yearly basis. There's that archangel again. But on a yearly basis, and not that it would touch you upon every year, but back then people had a lot more problems making it even to the first cycle of 20 years, much less what will you do into your 40s if you make it. Wouldn't you be real lucky if you made it to 60 back then? But man, if you could become the Ancient of Days and get over 80 years, this Methuselah concept, it would have been quite something. And with a little bit younger people getting married and so on there, and before perhaps the 20th year in some of these societies, you could easily see your great grandkids. I got to meet and talk to quite often my great great aunt. Thought that was unique the way it worked out, but it's from people having kids when they're real old and real young versus each other and so on that ran through the family trees. Again, we're back to that tree situation, aren't we? Yeah, they play a large part in that too. Hopefully you throw out good roots, and hopefully your fruit multiplies well for you. Peace.